I must say thanks so much for inviting me. And I was going to present a few slides. I don't think I will do so. I will try to elaborate a bit more about the points that have been made so far, which, by the way, I find extremely powerful, and I fully agree with most of them. But I will try to make three messages here. The very first one is that whatever happened to the COVID or the AI power of some of the algorithms, the point that we need to remind us is that we are at the moment at the tipping point of moving into a real fundamental knowledge economy. And that paradigm by itself, it's no way out. And that means it takes time to build Roma. It will take time to build all the elements, the building block, to make sure that we are full into the knowledge economy benefits that we want to see. But I'm very optimistic that this is something that would be for the good. The point number two I want to elaborate on is that a proof that this is possibly more than a bet is that there is a global race, and everyone is trying to take a piece of that new architecture, that new value chain, to make sure that they can benefit from the knowledge economy. And that race today has been a race which maybe we think that Europe is not necessarily good at, but I would say that the fundamental question is not that. The question is that in that race, is the race fair enough to make sure that everybody can benefit? And I will argue it's not the case at this stage. But three, I will also make a point about Europe, because actually we're talking about Europe at this stage. I don't think we should be negative. Europe has multiple paths for the future where it can actually benefit substantially and be a major player into the AI / supercomputing game. So let's go to each of these points one by one. The very first one is, and I think it has been said very well from a representative from IBM, we're moving to a knowledge economy. And that knowledge economy, there is fundamental paradigm shift. Let me take the example of economics, because I've got myself a PhD in economics. And economics is based on two basic principles, which you will see are no longer valid in the future of the AI supercomputing world. The very first one is that we have so many complex problems. In economics, the way we solve complexity is to go at the margin. We go always the marginal delta, such that we simplify mega problems and the complexity, because at the margins, the linear approximation is so tiny that you are pretty sure to be good, but you don't solve the problem at the systemic level. And the second axis of economic science has been testing. And in social science, as you know, it's very difficult to replicate experiments. So we've got statistical methods that try to go always to say, if you can prove that something is statistically different from the mainstream, then we can move. So you see that with these two elements of paradigm, you solve only problem at the margin, and you only can move on if you find something which is statistically robustly different from what you know, which with small data is usually not the case that often. So you are basically in a statu quo model. In the AI world, you will go for much more complex problem, and you have with big data many replicability that you can do. And that's the power of supercomputing. That's the power of AI algorithms and deep learning, which is that we are there to solve complex systems with possibly very different answers than the answers at the margin, and possibly can replicate and test it. Now, this being said, I also agree with the fact that for that system to work, we're going to need to change a bit of the architecture. This is true today that the supercomputing model has been much more parallel computing to include much more power into crunching data, if you like. But we all know that whatever system we moved on, the architecture needs to evolve. We've seen that between the PC, even the mobile. So obviously, if it moves to the AI, it will be the case as well. It also means that given the paradigm change, if we think about complex problem and we think about replicability, we need enough of clean data, enough of good real-time data, and it requires collaboration and solving issues like privacy, and incentive for people to share and collaborate this data. So all that will not be done in one day. But again, the point I wanted to make here is that we are at the beginning of that knowledge economy with a paradigm shift that requires that we build the building blocks. Supercomputing is one of that. AI tools are one of that. Data, cloud, architecture are another blocks of that. And all those blocks need to work out. It will take time, but I believe we are already well ahead into that fantastic journey for the future. So comes the second point, which is where do we stand today? As I said, let's not look at this as saying, well, it's not working as quickly as we think. Still believe today that the tens of cases of AI that I've seen are obviously most of the time very restricted, but in one way, the gain productivity, the gain in innovation system, the collaboration tools that I've seen coming from that are so promising. And personally, I think that the uplift in productivity coming from these knowledge economy tools are going to be fantastic, even if today, obviously not all the cases are working the way we want, but most of the time, it's not because the technology is not working, it's because the architecture bottleneck, is because the data is still small data or data are not clean enough. So there's still a lot of things to solve, but it's not from the power of the AI and the supercomputing architecture that we should claim that it's not working. It's the missing blocks that are not necessarily all organized to make it work. The only issue is that if you look today at the market as it stands, this is a market which, again, taking my hat as an economist, I would say is very concentrated. If you look today at any elements of computer visions, AI services, even robotics, the Erfindal index, which measure the concentration level of domains, is in the range for computer vision is up to 50%, which means that give and take, 2 firms globally could run the computer vision worldwide. And in robotics, it's in the range of 25%, which means that 4 firms, global firms, could run that world globally. Obviously, it's the beginning of those technologies, but definitely this is a power that needs to be worked out or at least watched out. Now, funnily enough, of course, Europe is not that bad. It's good in some of the robotics, is good in application of AI services, but this is where the market is the less concentrated, and where is not very good at is in computer vision, NLPs, machine learning, and the like. So, which reflects the point that yes, we need to watch out for that control. And last but not least, watch out on the way people try to continue the control. And there are basically 2 ways to go. One way is the patent race, and we see, for instance, much more Asia, where patentability or the proportion of firms making patents is being extremely high, in the range of 60%, and is driven also with a public-private partnership. Then you got the other extreme, which is the standardization battle, which is happening in the US, where some of the large players are obviously not necessarily patenting a lot of things, but are using their power to de facto creating standards. We talk about Tensor Processing is obviously a very good innovation, but in the same time, it can lead to a certain way of pushing certain type of crunching data and standardization, which at the end of the day is something to be solved. Having said that, we are at the beginning of the journey, and I believe that there are multiple European paths for the future. One still to make a point, this is something that Europe should do, but it should not miss the boat. We've seen that in the technology race, when somebody gets it wrong, it gets it wrong for a long, long time. Japan in the 80s were extremely good in consumer electronics. They didn't overspill that to AI at this stage, except in the pure robotics. China and US are possibly 2 part of the world having they say the AI. Let's not miss obviously India, with a very young population, and actually 70% of the stock of digital talents is actually happening in India. And India has an outsourcing service strategy from which they have outsourced a lot of the service from the US and from the Anglo-Saxon countries. So India is not that and possibly will push that. Having said that, what are the three paths, and I will finish on that, what are the three paths Europe could do given all that evolutions? The very first one, and I think most of the people from the Commission and from the Parliament have already said so, but I think that we are sometimes seen as overly regulating from the Europe point of view. I disagree with that term. It's about adequacy of regulations. I think the open data is going to be fundamental to make sure that SMEs, but also everybody has a playing field to use the data, because data is a public good. LGBT has been a very good aspect of all you treat, obviously, part of the privacy issues. So I believe that expanding on the regulation, especially from the adequacy of the playing field, is definitely something Europe needs to do. And Europe has the power to do it, because the balance today between excessive patenting and de facto standardization leads to concentration, which at the end of the day, regulation must solve. Point number two, is there a strategy at the frontier for Europe? Well, we talk already about the fact that Europe leads in supercomputing. I would say it's fantastic. I will also make the warning that watch out, supercomputing as a parallel programming and computing power is good, but most of the application of AI will possibly lead to a very different architecture, possibly more at the edge if we want AI to be successful. I think that's a point that has been already made. But also Europe as robotics is actually having its fair share in AI services. So we should continue to push downstreams to get that lead. And finally, on that path, I think there is no path where AI should be taken if it's not merged with sustainability and vice versa. Interestingly, Europe can differentiate in that race because the US is not necessarily that's in the sustainability game, and China is moving a bit of that, but at the end of the day, still a lot to learn from that perspective. And also think about the convergence that ICT AI will have with sustainability. What I mean by that is that the sectors that were lagging in digital maturity are likely to become much more digital because of sustainability. If you think about manufacturing, which is traditionally lagging, it takes to be much more sustainable and to create circular economic solutions. We're going to need extreme digitization where the full supply chain is totally digitized to have seamless open data flows such that the synchronization of the value chain exists. If you think about the sector like energy, it's quite evident that energy to be green will have to go to a system of distributed grids, for instance, which requires obviously an ICT layer. And last but not least, if you think of sectors that are leading on ICT, they will need sustainability themselves. That's the issues of how you consume excessive energies in the context of AI. Last but not least, the path three that Europe can take. Adequate regulation is one, differentiate frontier strategy is another one. The path three is that despite what people claim, we have a very large, vibrant digital ecosystem of startup. We have 75% of AI services coming from very young, small AI driven firms in Europe. In contrast, it's barely 30% in China because China is now very large firms, possibly with a layer of public-private partnership. We've got not only the countries, the way that we think about Europe, but we have the regions, and we see a lot of regional clusters and connections happening within the European market that basically create that digital ecosystem much more vibrant. And last but not least, we start to see an emergence of the VC industry, where there's a new culture of coaching of digital startup. I told you that I was part of an advisory board for Fortino Capital. That's an example of a company that basically create that VC structure for the bet that the large, vibrant digital ecosystem can emerge in Europe. So last but not least, the point I wanted to make again is that Rome is not done in one day. Two, it's the future is here. We have to shape it. And three, Europe has a lot to say. And what he has done so far in regulation, in supercomputing, or in developing the startup ecosystem is actually something that needs to be scaled, but it's a promising start. Thank you.